Hello and welcome to today's conference. I'm excited to be here with you. I'm William Rolak. I am the Vice President of Diversity Inclusion for Workforce Logic. And I'm here just to have a simple conversation and chat around the diversity evolution and really this evolution to total inclusion. And what does that mean for all of us? There's been a big debate around allyship versus altruism. We'll get a chance to address that today as well. And really determine what is a best practice. What is a best practice for employee engagement? You know, this session has been dedicated to having really a point of reference for one of the most prevalent strategic implications for diversity and inclusion strategy, and that is employee engagement. There's been many different designs over the years, from affinity networks, employee resource groups, business resource groups to that effect, and of course, diversity and inclusion councils. We're going to get a chance to really go through some different phases of this approach and this growth from affinity networks right through to inclusion networks or inclusion groups. And what does that look like? You know, how can we begin to ensure that all voices are heard, you know, across the actual business enterprise? And then again, look at what levels, what are the critical routes to employees joining the company's inclusions initiatives? What does that look like across the board from, again, affinity networks to inclusion councils? So here's a few key points today that we want to get through within the agenda of our conversation. The history of affinity networks, where did it come from? Why did it come about? We'll also look at these structures, the structures for employee engagement around affinity networks, employee resource groups, business resource groups, and inclusion councils. And most of all, this battle or debate between allyship versus altruism. And again, there are some best practices. So we can't just have a debate or without solutions. So we're also going to share some best practices for affinity groups or resource groups in that regard. The history of affinity networks. And so let's talk about this history. You know, what's an affinity network? What's an affinity group? You know, it's predominantly a group that's formed of shared interests for a common goal, which individuals either formally or informally belong. These groups were literally sought, you know, to create a safe haven for those who found themselves excluded. And most of all, they felt excluded because of discrimination, how they were perceived by others at work. And, you know, by, you know, late 60s, early 70s through, you know, by 2007, almost mere 90% of all Fortune 500 companies had resource groups or BRGs or affinity networks at that point. So let's go back to a quick historical perspective before we get into the really debate around altruism and allyship. You know, it's kind of interesting, you know, we always talk about history repeating itself. And in the mid 60s or early 60s, for that matter, you know, for those of you who may be home to New York or centric to the Northeast, may be familiar with the night of July 24th, 1964. You know, when city policemen with dogs arrested a young African-American male in Rochester, New York, which began the Rochester race riots. You know, the riots ended on August 3rd, but the fight for equality still continued. You know, it left 5 people killed and many were injured, and there were many issues still unaddressed. Community organizations like the Urban League of Rochester and FIGHT, which was Freedom, Independence, God, Honor, and Today, those organizations emerged, you know, as advocacy organizations for changes in the hiring practices. Hear me out. This was just not for justice or against police brutality. This was for hiring practice and improved relations between citizens and police, improvements in urban housing conditions, and other measures of equality in the city and the community of Rochester, New York. So in response to those situations and those pressures from the Urban League in 1964 and continuing, you know, those pressures led to, you know, the former CEO of Xerox, Joseph Wilson, came up with an idea, you know, in response to those race riots that occurred in Rochester, New York, you know, where Xerox was headquartered. At the time, Xerox had a progressive hiring program, you know, but again, hiring Black or African-American heritage employees within Xerox in Rochester, those employees still faced major discrimination within the workplace. And so at that point, you know, one of the things that Joseph Wilson wanted to do was set up a way that we can create a safe haven for employees. And so you talk about a diversity and inclusion idea being born out of race riots. In 1970, Wilson and Xerox, Black employees launched what was called at that point the National Black Employees Caucus. And this was to create a safe space, for Black employees to discuss their experiences and again, advocate for change within their company without repercussions, without being terminated or fired because they're speaking out about not getting a promotion or not getting an opportunity or not being able to move up the ladder to a more challenging and intellectually stimulating roles within the organization. And this caucus at Xerox was actually the first official ERG, and again, this is 1970. At the same time, IBM in New York was faced with those same challenges. And so for those of you who may know and know of Ted Childs, joined IBM in 1967, still in reference to the challenges, race riots, again, not only in Rochester, but other places around the country as well, as we know. IBM also joined this fight and this battle to create equality within the workplace, especially again during this evolution. And my point today, as we look at what has happened with George Floyd and other societal challenges we've had in 2020, this all sounds familiar. That organizations now taking a stand and beginning to look at even more closely having a chief diversity officer and looking at their inclusion resources and how they go about inclusion, whether it be diversity councils, launching diversity councils, bringing on an individual to be faced with some of these societal issues and help the organization understand what inclusion and engagement truly means. And if you go back to those beginnings, those beginnings of affinity networks and, what happened in Rochester and Xerox's, response, as well as IBM's response with hiring Ted Childs as their leader at that particular time around EEO and affirmative action. And as Ted grew in his career and became the chief diversity officer, those first challenges in early 70s when, late 60s, early 70s, when he first was challenged to bring in those first engineers to IBM, an interesting story here that has an interesting outcome to also aspiring to affinity networks and bringing individuals together in safe havens is the idea that when he first brought in those first HBCU graduates, those first Black African-American engineers to IBM, their first day of work, as any newcomers to any organization would have it, especially at that particular time where there were still challenges in the workplace. Those first 5 individuals who came into work at IBM from those HBCUs from the South and other schools in the Northeast, when those first African-American males came in, their first day of employment, their first day of work, they sat together at lunch. And I would ask the question or poll the audience at this point to say, where do you think they ended up before the end of the day? Well, I'm here to tell you, the story has it that they actually all ended up in human resources because everyone was uncomfortable with those 5 individuals sitting together at lunch. And of course, at that point, Ted's being called into the head of HR's office and said, hey, you just brought these guys in, they're disrupting the workforce. And so in this evolution, Ted's question to the head of HR, well, which one of these guys are going to invite them over to their table tomorrow for lunch? So the aspect of the affinity network resource groups where it all began was out of necessity. It was not just because we wanted to get together. It was because we wanted to get together and just comfortably have lunch in very hostile work environments. And so a lot has changed. A lot has come along. There is a debate about affinity networks being still relevant or the relevance of having individuals come together on a common accord. And there is great relevance to that because even today where you have affinity networks, ERGs, BRGs, et cetera, there's a huge challenge to make sure that people have safe space conversations. And when those safe space conversations happen, it is very important that we understand that there's no debating. There's never a debate in a safe space conversation. Doesn't mean you can't have a mixed audience. It just means that there are certain agreements that have to be met in those safe space conversations. So we look at this shift, look at the big shift from this affinity network to, again, moving to total inclusion. And this is really setting a basis for the challenge or the debate between allyship and altruism. And so as we move forward and we look at the growing or easing of the pain of different sets of demographic, different races, gender, LGBTQ, embracing our individuals with disabilities in the workplace, veterans, et cetera, in all race categories. A new hire today might not be challenged with finding a lunch partner. And if they would probably walk into the lunchroom by themselves, they would have someone invite them over. So, you know, those things that we're faced with in the late 60s and early 70s, we're not necessarily faced with today. So our goal today is to get to a point where we're looking at an organization from a point of total inclusion. How do we have all voices heard, no matter what the differences in perspectives? You know, my point in working through Workforce Logic and working through our organization is to ensure that, you know, we celebrate our similarities and learn from our differences. That is the challenge we're faced with today, from the standpoint of moving from diversity to inclusion and having both of them operate together. Let's look at a case or a quick business case from 2017. You know, 2017, a lot happened that year when, you know, Deloitte decided to, you know, I won't say downgrade, but merge their diversity circles, right? And the challenge here was, you know, one was really ending its women network and other affinity groups and starting a focus on men. And that focus that Deloitte had and the leader had at that particular time was not only to focus on getting more men involved, it was getting more white males involved in the conversation. Because we know when affinity networks are set up, initially in any organization, it actually continues an old paradigm, I'll call it, an old paradigm where cisgender white males, for some reason, don't categorize as a diversity. So it's like, it's almost we'll call it almost an oxymoron, where you build a diversity initiative that leaves individuals out systematically by design of employee engagement networks. And so moving toward total inclusion now, as you know, Deloitte saw it at that point to get more males involved, was to reduce those number of circles and make more inclusion networks. You know, really defining diversity is really about everyone is included. You know, if there's any organization that's defining diversity by resource groups, and if your only aspect of diversity is based on your resource groups, that may be by general EEO categories or gender or race or LGBTQ veterans and disabilities, that may not be a holistic definition. And so in moving forward, what looks like a holistic definition of diversity and inclusion is really beginning to bring employees together to work together on initiatives that resource groups are already currently engaged in. 4 major focus areas that I believe are true and strong to this, you know, is workplace culture, workforce, social responsibility, and marketplace. You know, as we bring these employees together to work on those types of initiatives, it brings one thing into play. It rules out that the only way for those who are left out of your resource groups to only get engaged through allyship, it gives them an opportunity to get engaged through altruism. Where does their heart lie? Where do they want to contribute? How are they coming to the game of diversity and inclusion? And what do they want to contribute? Give them the opportunity to contribute in a unique way that they want to contribute. Workplace culture simply focuses on all the things that resource groups are doing currently to celebrate. The biggest learnings right now around, or biggest learnings lost, I would say, around resource groups is that individuals of similar communities, backgrounds, cultures, et cetera, are coming together to have a conversation to present their best in class. And so, for example, if you have, you know, from my background and heritage being of African-American ancestry, and of course, this month, a big shout out to Black History Month. If we're coming together and we're talking about all the amazing fraternities and sororities and We're talking about the amazing HBCUs and amazing women organizations like Links and Coalition of 100 Black Women, Coalition of 100 Black Men, National Urban League, and other organizations that are doing goodwill in our communities. Then it's just us having a conversation. There's no learning that's happening exponentially outside of our groups. Same for veterans, same for LGBTQ, same for women. It is a siloed conversation happening in an echo chamber. Those actual conversations should be happening with an entire group of employees, diverse of employees. So by launching an initiative that brings that intersectionality together for those employees through altruism that actually want to focus on celebrating cultures, there's now one learning conversation. Because a lot of times when we migrate into that conference room at the end of the hall and we're planning for Black History Month and we're talking about all these amazing organizations, everybody else only hears from one organization that we select to come in. So the most beautiful part of this transition from working through allyship and working through altruism brings us together under one accord. The same around the workforce for talent conversations happening together. Same around social responsibility. There's a lot of organizations right now that are hiring D&I executives that are also listening to their employees who want to launch specific groups that's in reference to their pain, thereby further separating the conversation. And so it doesn't mean that just because we are a similar race or gender that have suffered through some pain that others don't care or others don't want to be in a part of our conversation. So we really have to look at how are we bringing people to the table. Altruism gives us an opportunity to bring everyone to the table and have them get engaged and involved where necessary. There's a lot of great best practices out there for resource groups and things of that nature. Just again, imagine working together around structures, again, for the highest levels of employee engagement. A point of reference for those organizations that have affinity networks, ERGs or BRGs, approximately 15 to 20% of the organization participates, employee participation. For those organizations that have built the structure through altruism, you actually have about 50 to 80% employee participation, because employees are coming to the table through the point of engagement where they actually get an opportunity to participate based on their want and desire. I've had a lot of conversations with resource groups around, best practices and what that looks like. Again, if we'll get into best practices, but I just want to take a second to further define allyship and altruism, just to make this point very clear. Allyship and there's a lot of organizations that define allyship as when people are aware that aspects of their identities hold more power and influence than aspects of others. Identities and use of their advantage position to advocate for people in less advantaged positions. So, what that really means is just not about issues, but it's also about being with people or, supporting individuals through their challenges. Allyship is truly a practice of uplifting others who have enjoyed advantages, or, a practice of uplifting others who've enjoyed the advantages that you may have enjoyed. So allyship is absolutely one way to come to the table, but it should not be the only vehicle for those who are not of a similar gender, ethnicity, race, background, or community to get involved with any efforts of an ERG. Altruism is absolutely categorized as selflessness, concern for the well-being of others, So, a couple key points around altruistic individuals: selfishly looking out for others, being proactive, being empathetic, and being self-confident, So, these individuals are geared to make the world a better place. Do we want to invite someone into an allyship situation to help us as an organization or as a community? Or do we want to invite them in to share in the responsibility of making our community and our organization a better place? So it's two distinct differences there in bringing someone into allyship versus altruism. I've had a lot of opportunities in my career to coach CDOs and CMOs and CEOs and CHROs in this work. And we find it very interesting and challenging that, resource groups have this sense of ownership on their title, on the name of their organization, and begin to market their work in ways back to the organization, only to allow individuals to join through allyship. So a lot of times we'll see the subject matter will first say the name of the ERG, and that's the leading implication of getting engaged or getting involved. There are many organizations that I've had a chance to coach and ERG leaders who've actually invited individuals in for great causes, for going out and building a home for Habitat for Humanity, going out in a community to read books to elementary school students at Carter G. Woodson Elementary School in their community, a predominantly African-American and Hispanic community. Things that they're doing of great cause and great worth, but they constantly lead with the name of the ERG in the subject. Altruism lends itself to leading with the purpose, not the name of the ERG, because a lot of times people are like, well, I've never done any work with this ERG, and so they're probably not reading that email. They're clicking the delete button, but not seeing the big cause or purpose. Working through altruism lends itself to say, join the colleagues of XYZ company as we go out and build this home for Habitat for Humanity. Unfortunately, that message is usually buried in the message and not in the subject line. There's absolutely no reason to lead with the ERG's title. Lead with your message, lead with your passion point, lead with a point that where others can get involved, and simply put at the bottom of your email, powered by the XYZ resource group. Leading with it may not be your level of engagement or ability to engage others. And so really begin to think about what coming to the table as an ally and coming to the table through altruism as you begin to engage, others within the group. For those organizations who are working through resource groups to get their work done now, here's a few additional key points that I think would be extremely helpful as you begin to build your organization of engagement through altruism as an additional vehicle and not just allyship, and finding ways for others to get involved. Best practices for resource groups, blackout periods. We always talk about intersectionality. There are 4 major blackout periods during the year that we can actually take advantage of. And those 4 blackout periods are simply this. It's areas where there's total intersectionality throughout the year. One of those areas are very clear is women. Women is Women's History Month is coming up. International Women's Day will be happening. And every resource group has women engaged and involved of all different complexities, backgrounds, experience, communities, cultures, etc. And most times the month is just simply owned by the women's resource group. So when we look at moving to a more altruistic and total inclusion environment, Women's History Month is an opportunity to have a blackout period. Other resource groups should not be running professional development programs during Women's History Month. They should not be doing it during Pride Month, where again, there's total intersectionality, or disabilities, or veterans. Those are the 4 major key categories where there's an opportunity, what we would call blackout periods during the course of the year. It does a couple of things. One, it brings an opportunity for everyone to support one cause, which also gives us an aggregated outcome of total numbers of hours contributed, total charitable dollars earned, the number or plethora of organizations. If your topic for the month, for Women's History Month, is just lifting women in all communities, every resource group gets an opportunity to lift women in their community. But again, it's an aggregate effect on the outcomes and the impact on the business as you look at that. Same for Pride, disabilities, and veterans. Doesn't necessarily mean we have to do everything in one scheme, but it does lend us the opportunity to do something for one cause from an intersectionality standpoint. So really begin to think of blackout periods. It actually reduces the multitude of the number of impact points or events or activities throughout the year, gives the resource groups an opportunity to begin to work together more through intersectionality and altruism. And again, not just inviting people in through the name or the brand of the ERG, but the cause that's associated with what you're doing. Also think about no more 30, 60, 90. And I will quickly explain a little bit what I mean by 30, 60, 90. No more planning for activities or events in 30, 60, and 90 days. Really look at having an annual strategic planning session. And this is with anything. This is with whether you have an inclusive or inclusion council or even your resource groups. So begin thinking about having an annual strategic planning session in the fourth quarter of the year or mid-year. Align it with your fiscal year at the moment in time in which your senior executives and your CEO sets the strategy for the new year. So you can begin to plan to take your 4 key strategic objectives or 5 key strategic objectives for the business and align your efforts with those strategic objectives simply by putting a diversity lens over what the organization is trying to achieve and understanding where you can leverage your resource group and altruism to affect what the business is trying to achieve. So be sure to look at aligning your core strategies with the business. As resource groups grow in organizations or as they transition to become diversity inclusion councils, there's always going to be a point around having a core strategic plan aligned with the organization. Again, one of the major debates, as we talked about, is coming into this work through allyship or altruism. There's an opportunity to engage more. As I said earlier, with those organizations that have resource groups, you get engagement around 15 to 20% of the employee population. For those organizations that engage through altruism, where number one, diversity is defined by everyone being included. Everyone is a part of the diversity effort, not just the resource groups. Anywhere from 50 to 80% participation may happen throughout the year when you have that specific situation. And there's always, again, that debate about, well, if we don't have resource groups, how do I focus on my community? How do I focus on what our needs are? 2 things. One, there's a collective effort to help you support your needs by having a collective conversation with everyone who has a similar passion to advance themselves in the workforce. And then also, when there's a community affected by strife or pain, there's always an opportunity to pull back and have safe space conversations. Where, again, safe space conversations have rules. There's no debates on someone's pain. Employees come into that room with empathy and, and support for those who are in pain. As you begin to do this work, begin to look at ways in which this migration to total inclusion will have more impact, and look at ways that you can work, again, moving from allyship and moving to total inclusion. In conclusion, as we wrap up today's conversation, there's a few key points that I want to make reference to and just really bring us back to the point of this altruism versus allyship and really coming to the table with a purpose, getting others engaging, involved. I think it's very, interesting. And I had a chance to share that story of the history of affinity networks and one of the places it all got started. And the reasons why it got started, being of a different culture, background, race, or gender, coming into an organization, being the new person there, being the only person there, or the only few. There was a day and time where affinity networks had great meeting because it gave us the opportunity to come together and have lunch without repercussions. Today, again, I don't think we have that challenge as much as we had then. I don't think you're going into any environment without having someone invite you over to a table or invite you into a conversation. So moving forward, again, look at your structures, look at how you're bringing people together. It's more important than ever to bring employees together around diversity with the understanding of defining diversity with a keen sense of diversity simply means everyone. Don't leave anyone out of your process. Really look at this paradigm of, there are a lot of chief diversity officers or heads of diversity coming out of 2020 that are launching affinity networks as your first point of reference. Remember that first point of reference either creates total inclusion or it creates exclusion by design. Remember, there's 2 ways to diversity inclusion. There's 2 ways to the effort. There are at least 2 vehicles. My advice to you is not just use the vehicle of allyship. also begin to drive this vehicle of altruism. Bring people together, bring them together based on their passion points and their points around supporting each other, which is going to be critical to the work that you do. And again, those best practices to resource groups, creating blackout periods, looking at the ability of having great intersectionality with each other. Look at points where you can drive your message home of your passion, of what you're doing for your communities in which you live, work, and play, and your organizations are either producing products, goods, and services for. Find ways and remember to first promote the passion point or promote the reason for giving or the reason for what you're doing, even before your brand name of the network or the affinity network or the resource group. Those are some extreme best practices to get others engaged and get others involved in this process. I want to thank you for allowing me to come in and share some thoughts with you today around allyship versus altruism, and also share this journey of evolution from affinity networks to total inclusion. This work takes a great deal of emotional fortitude. And so continue to keep your energy, can keep your spirits up, stand in your area of your purpose and your passion. This work, that we're doing today and others who've done this work well before us, we are seeing some of those benefits today, and there's benefits that we're contributing to that we won't get to see in our careers that will benefit others. And so I'm excited to do this work, excited to be a part of the organization, excited to be a part of Workforce Logic and lead the efforts of diversity and inclusion. Again, I want to thank you today for being a part of the conference and being part of this conversation. Thank you.